That night, Hearst Castle no longer glowed with the dazzling lights of the grand parties of years past. The long corridors echoed with the slow footsteps of a man who had reached the end of his life. William Randolph Hearst lay there, in a room so vast that even the silence felt heavy. No more printing presses running through the night. No more sensational headlines that once shook the nation. No more phone calls from politicians, tycoons, or those who had once lived in cautious respect of his power. Only an aging man remained, carrying the memory of a time when an entire country read what he wanted them to read, believed what he allowed them to believe. Outside, the wind swept past the cold stone windows. The walls that had witnessed luxury, power, and ambition now held nothing but stillness. All his life, Hearst had written the fate of others with his pen. But in this final moment, there was no newspaper to write about him the way he had once written about the world. And within that very castle, surrounded by the wealth he had spent a lifetime pursuing, before William Randolph Hearst became a name that made all of America listen, he was just a boy growing up in a wealthy family that was far from peaceful. His father, George Hearst, was a self-made man who rose from gold and silver mines, carrying an unshakable belief that money was the only true measure of success. His mother, Phoebe Hearst, by contrast, was an educated woman who loved art, believed in education, and valued social responsibility. Caught between these two worlds, William grew up. On one side was the coldness of power and wealth. On the other was a longing to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be heard. From an early age, William never lacked material comfort. What he constantly lacked was the feeling that he truly mattered in the eyes of others, especially in the eyes of his father. George Hearst loved his son, but it was a strict, heavy kind of love, always accompanied by expectation. William was expected to become worthy of inheriting a vast fortune, even though he was never certain he wanted that destiny for himself. The boy was sent to the finest schools, lived in houses that many people would never step into in their entire lives. Yet that wealth did not give William confidence. Instead, it made him feel as though he was forever living in the shadow of an overwhelmingly large father. William loved writing. He was drawn to words, to the power of telling a story that could make others stop, listen, and believe. While his father saw his son's future in numbers and assets, William saw the world through pages of text. When George Hearst passed away, William was still very young. An enormous legacy was suddenly placed on the shoulders of someone who had not yet figured out who he truly was. That loss was not only the pain of a son losing his father, but also the emptiness of someone who had never quite been acknowledged. It was within that emptiness that ambition began to take shape. Not an ambition simply to become richer, because William was already exceedingly wealthy. It was an ambition to prove himself, to see his name appear, to hear his own voice resonate among the crowd. The first newspaper William took over was not an empire. It was chaotic, directionless, and looked down upon. But to William, it was an opportunity. For the first time in his life, he had something that truly belonged to him. William did not want to make newspapers the way others did. He did not want journalism to exist solely to inform. He wanted it to create emotion, to provoke conflict. William Randolph Hearst's decision did not come in a sudden, explosive moment. It arrived quietly, the way a person slowly realizes that there is no longer any way back to the old path. After his father's death, William stood at a crossroads that very few young people could fully comprehend. He had money. He had status. He even had a safe future if he simply did what others expected of him. But safety did not give William a sense of existence. He did not want to be merely the caretaker of a dead man's wealth. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. In cold boardrooms, surrounded by men older and more experienced than himself, William was often dismissed as an impulsive rich boy. They did not trust his instincts. They did not believe that journalism could become something more than dry, factual reporting. But William believed. He believed that people do not read newspapers only to learn what happened. They read to feel anger, to feel fear, to choose a side. That belief pushed William to begin changing everything. He intervened in every page, every headline, every line of text. Stories became bolder. Images grew larger. Language became sharper. And emotion, for the first time, moved to the center of the news. Not everyone agreed. Many argued that William was destroying journalistic ethics, that he was turning news into a tool of agitation. But William did not step back, because to him, this was no longer about journalism. It was a battle for the attention of an entire nation. The more opposition he faced, the more convinced William became that he was on the right path. Each newspaper that sold better than the day before was proof. Each time his name appeared more often on the streets, in cafes, in everyday conversations, it was a confirmation. William Randolph Hearst began to realize an important truth. That power does not necessarily come from titles or wealth. True power lies in the ability to shape the story that others believe to be true. And it was at that moment that he made a decision from which there would be no turning back. William did not just want to make newspapers. He wanted to own a voice. From one paper, then two, then many more, William expanded so rapidly that even those who had once looked down on him began to grow wary. He did not wait for approval. He bought, reshaped, and imposed his vision on everything he touched. At an age when many were still struggling to find their place, William Randolph Hearst had already begun building a machine capable of influencing the thoughts of millions, not with weapons, but with words. Yet at the same time, something else was quietly taking shape. An excessive attachment to control. A fear of being ignored, returning stronger than before. William did not just want to be heard. He needed to be heard. And that need, born from a boy who once lived in his father's shadow, became the force that pushed him farther than anyone had ever imagined. So far, when William Randolph Hearst entered the peak of his career, America was no longer merely reading his newspapers. America began living inside the world he was telling. Hearst's name was everywhere, on crowded newsstands every morning, in small diners where workers flipped through pages while arguing over shocking headlines, in political meeting rooms where people did not just follow events, but worried about how Hearst would write about them. From New York to San Francisco, Hearst's newspaper empire expanded at a pace that left many struggling to understand what was happening. He did not simply own newspapers. He owned attention. William Randolph Hearst understood one thing very clearly. If he could make millions of people look at the same story, feel the same emotion, then truth itself could become flexible. And in that world, whoever controlled the story controlled power. Headlines grew larger. Language grew harsher. Images grew bolder. News was no longer merely information. It became guided emotion, outrage amplified, fear cultivated. And Hearst stood at the center of it all. He was not just a media tycoon. He was the one who decided who received attention and who was forgotten, who became a hero, who was turned into an enemy. In those years, many politicians understood that the path to the public could not bypass Hearst. They needed him. And at the same time, they feared him. A single article could elevate them, but it could also destroy everything overnight. William Randolph Hearst was never elected to any office. Yet his influence seeped into decisions large and small across the country. He did not stand at a podium. He stood behind the printed page. That power gave Hearst the feeling he had been seeking since his youth. The feeling of being heard, of being seen, of being acknowledged. But at the same time, another obsession quietly began to form. the fear of losing attention. Hearst did not allow his empire to slow down. He did not allow his newspapers to become ordinary. Each day had to be more shocking than the one before. Each story stronger, deeper, more dramatic. Those who worked for him felt that pressure clearly. Reporters did not simply write news. They wrote according to Hearst's vision. Truth, at times, became something that could be bent to serve a larger story. And when power reached its peak, the line between influence and manipulation began to blur. William Randolph Hearst knew exactly what he held in his hands. He understood that a single wrong choice could make the entire system turn against him. And so, he tightened his control even further. The more people read his newspaper, no empire collapses in a single day. For William Randolph Hearst, the cracks appeared very early, but they were carefully concealed beneath power and splendor. As Hearst Castle grew closer to completion, as parties still glowed with lights and laughter, pressure was already building inside Hearst's newspaper empire. Costs kept rising. Vast sums were continuously poured into stone, wood, art, and dreams with no clear end. Hearst was not accustomed to hearing the word no. His entire life, he had been used to giving orders and being listened to. So when the numbers began to look troubling, he chose to tighten control rather than step back. Inside the newsrooms, the atmosphere changed noticeably. Editorial decisions were no longer discussions. They were commands. Hearst read every page, edited every headline, intervened in every line of text. He did not tolerate mistakes, nor did he accept dissent. To Hearst, every article did not merely represent the newspaper. It represented himself. And any criticism aimed at the content felt to him like a personal threat. Gradually, those who had once worked closely beside Hearst began to keep their distance, not because they lacked loyalty, but because they understood that the closer one stood to power, the greater the risk. Emotion-driven decisions appeared more and more often. Unnecessary confrontations were pushed onto the front pages. Relationships that had once brought advantage began to fracture. Hearst did not realize that it was precisely his fear of being ignored that drove him to push everything too far. He needed to win in every argument, in every story. As the outside world began to change, Hearst responded by clinging even more tightly to what had once brought him success. He did not adapt. He controlled. In rare moments alone, Hearst began to feel a weariness he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. Not physical exhaustion, but the mental fatigue of a man who always had to keep power firmly in his hands. Hearst Castle was no longer a place for display. It became a refuge, a fortress that separated him from the growing chorus of opposition outside. But the more he withdrew, the farther Hearst drifted from reality. He believed that if he held on tightly enough, the world would once again return to listening to him as it had before. No one dared to speak plainly to Hearst that the era was changed. The era had changed, but William Randolph Hearst had not. In the years that followed, America entered a different phase. War, economic crisis, new priorities for the public. People were no longer seeking sensation the way they once had. They needed information, they needed truth, they needed trust. And that was precisely what Hearst's newspaper system began to lose. The papers were still printed regularly. Large headlines still appeared every morning, but their weight was no longer the same. Revenue declined. Advertising pulled out. Operating costs became an enormous burden. For the first time in his life, Hearst faced an enemy he could not manipulate. Time. Debts accumulated. Past mistakes began to return. Every stone in Hearst Castle now carried a price that had to be paid. The man who once believed money was the tool to control the world now had to confront the reality that money, too, has limits. Hearst tried to maintain appearances. He sold off assets. scaled back operations. Yet he still refused to give up his dream of absolute power. Inside the castle, parties grew fewer. Vast rooms fell silent. Familiar guests no longer appeared as often. Hearst was there, surrounded by the luxury he himself had created, yet more alone than ever. He was no longer the one leading the conversation. He became someone standing on the sidelines, watching the world move in ways he could no longer control. Hollywood, once deferential, now kept its distance. Politicians who had once sought him out no longer needed him. And then came a symbolic blow. The film Citizen Kane was released. Though it never mentioned his name, all of America understood who the character represented. A media tycoon, wealthy, powerful, yet lonely and hollow. Hearst was outraged. He tried to block the film, applied pressure, issued threats. But this time, his power was no longer strong enough. Citizen Kane was still released, and it did something no newspaper had ever done. It placed a mirror in front of Hearst. A mirror reflecting not an empire, but a man. William Randolph Hearst passed away. But Hearst never truly disappeared. His name no longer appeared on newspaper pages every day. His castle became a tourist destination. His media empire was restructured, scaled down, adapted to a new world. But Hearst's way of thinking remained. Every time a headline is written to shock rather than to inform. Every time emotion is prioritized over truth. Every time news is designed to manipulate public fear or outrage. There, the shadow of Hearst is still present. He did not invent sensational journalism, but he perfected it. He turned it into a machine of power, strong enough to shake politics, society, and the perception of millions. Hearst understood something very early on, that whoever controls the story controls emotion, and whoever controls emotion can influence action. That legacy is both an achievement and a warning. America today has thousands of media channels, faster speed, stronger technology, wider reach. But the core question remains the same as in Hearst's time. Who is telling this story? And what do they want us to feel? Hearst left behind a costly lesson about power. That power does not come only from money or position. It comes from the ability to shape collective perception. But he also left another lesson. That power without ethics ultimately destroys the one who holds it. Hearst won many battles. But he did not defeat his era. He failed to adapt to a world where the public began asking more questions, where skepticism became instinct, and where trust was no longer given easily. Looking back at Hearst, people no longer see only a media tycoon. They see a man carried away by the very tool he created. He once believed that if he could control information, he could control history. But history, in the end, still tells the story in its own way. Today, as we scroll past hundreds of headlines each day, as our emotions are stretched by carefully calculated words, Hearst's story feels closer than ever. It reminds us that not everything that is printed is truth, and not every story is innocent. The story of William Randolph Hearst ends here, but the questions he left behind do not. If you have ever believed a headline, ever been swept away by a story, ever wondered who was really behind those words, perhaps history is still speaking to us every day. If you want to continue exploring America's forgotten stories, the people who once stood at the pinnacle of power, and the true price they had to pay, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with Use of Forgotten Files. Because history is not just the past. It is a mirror for us to see ourselves today.